Welcome to my lecture series on Immanuel Kant, one of the most transformative thinkers in human history. Definitely the most transformative thinker in my life. I guess Kant was, I'm trying to think back here. I guess I started reading Nietzsche first when I first started reading philosophy. And it was reading Nietzsche was like you think, I don't know if you've had this experience, but you think you know what he's talking about while you're reading. You're reading him, and like truth is a woman, say if truth is a woman and this kind of stuff. And then when you put the book down and someone says, oh, so what's it about? And, you feel like the whole time you're reading him, you know what it's about. But when someone asks you, it's kind of like leaves you blank. Like you're just like, I don't actually know what it's about. And that's the first sign that you're on the path. But reading Kant is a totally different experience. Reading Kant is like from the moment you start reading him, or the moment I started reading him, I don't have a clue what he's talking about. And the thing is that Kant was obviously much earlier than Nietzsche, or even like it says today Heidegger. Kant was really, there was a huge transition when Kant was writing. Kant was the starting point of the Enlightenment. And he has all of his own, they call it neologisms, right? So he has all of his own language, just like Heidegger. But the thing is with Kant, the things that's involved with his own language, of course, his own concepts, and they really have to be unpacked. So that's what I'm doing here in part one. And that's why I titled part one, Understanding Kant, because this is where we will meet the man himself. His life in Königsberg. And Königsberg is what I guess he was speaking German, but now it is a part of Russia, right? It is a part of Russia now, where it used to be a German settlement. And we're going to take a look at his intellectual awakening. So what I've tried to create is a clear step-by-step exposition of every major concept and argument in his critical philosophy, rendered into contemporary English without jargon where possible, and with careful explanation where jargon is unavoidable. In part two, we're going to look at the death and resurrection of philosophy. So we will witness something extraordinary. Kant's transcendental forms of intuition and categories of understanding resurrected in the living architecture of the human brain, specifically the entorhinal hippocampal navigation system. Now, this is going to get very, very interesting. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I did do the research. I did do the reading. Entorhinal, so that's ENTORHINAL, entorhinal hippocampal navigation system. It's a part of our brain, right? And this has been revealed by 21st century biological physics and neuroscience. And it's, you can look it up yourself. There's lots to read up on this, but they're using basically the same physics that they try to, understand the way the universe works. They use that in neuroscience now in the brain. And strangely enough, it correlates to Kant's concepts, his transcendental forms of intuition and categories. So I will fully, that'll be a deep dive. I'll make sure that you can understand it the way that I could understand it, and on we go. In part 3, I have a work. It is called the Apodictic Imago Dei. So we will confront what I believe was Kant's deepest lifelong mission, and that is to translate the theological doctrine of the human being as Imago Dei, that is the image of God, from an article of contested faith into an apodictic certainty of pure reason itself. I think it's well known, if you know anything about Kant, is that he was raised in a Lutheran Christian home, and he did have even though his philosophy, he says, we could never know if there is a God, but we have to make room for faith. And the way that he proposes the human mind and the way he proposes human life, I truly believe that he was actually trying to explain to us that we are made in the image of God. And so that will be my argument, for that in part 3. In part 4, reclaiming reason, we will trace the historical aftermath of Kant's philosophy, examining the twofold misprision where his successors, from the German idealists to Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the postmodernists, they dismantled his critical boundaries and abandoned the structured manifold. We will see how this rejection of Kant's epistemological limits and ethical foundation ultimately plunged modern philosophy into existential dread, nihilism, and the fragmented social reality we face today. And finally, we will issue a corrective term, demonstrating how reclaiming Kant's a priori conditions for shared experience in the categorical imperative provides the indispensable blueprint for rebuilding a rational, ethical community and securing human dignity by the 21st century. There will be more, and these will be followed by other aspects of Kantian thought and history. So, if you're new to Kant, what I just said there probably sounds like a whole bunch of you don't know what, but that's kind of the exciting part, because by the time we're done part 1 here, I think you're going to be able to grasp it enough that if you were to listen back to this, that you will easily listen through it. And I have to be honest, this is kind of one of the exciting things about philosophy is we read something and it literally bewilders us. Like we're lost in the woods, we read it and we just can't really take a hold of what's being said. And, I do encourage reading secondary sources. There's just loads of stuff on YouTube. But if I was you, I'd stay towards the academic stuff, not guys like me. But yeah, once you start grasping the concepts that you've tried, when you actually put an effort into something and it's very difficult and you just say like, why am I doing this? But the thing is, it keeps drawing you in. And if you do your due diligence and you stick with that, there are major rewards here. And when you go back to the book and you start rereading it again and you can see what the book is saying, like you read these words, you're traveling through the concepts and you could understand it, man, that is why I stuck to philosophy, purely for that dopamine kick of like, being able to be with the immensity of these thinkers and just the absolute creative thinking that goes into this. I mean, that's what it really is. I mean, this is such creative thinking. I mean, you have to think about Kant here for a second. I mean, he lived in like the late 1700s, right? Like he lived in like, I think the critique came out in like 1781. Something like this, or maybe earlier. I mean, I could pause and look, but anyways, I just want to talk about it. It came out, and I mean, like, he was 40 years old when that came out. And this is at a time where there's like, there's no TV, there's no electricity, like there's no technology. I mean, there was, they could write, and I think there might have been newspapers. I mean, I'd have to look back at when the printing press started, but anyways, they didn't have a lot of medical knowledge, none of these things. So, I mean, look at Plato 2,500 years ago. I mean, yes, there's a lot of stuff that they didn't get right, that, modern science can look at now and just kind of be like, okay. But there's a lot of stuff that is written and, that was spoken about that is like, I mean, the prediction or just the absolute insight, the knowledge to understand things that we use like special equipment nowadays to understand. So, I mean, Kant, the rigor, the absolute amount of rigor and effort that must have went into his work is unbelievable. So I'm like a Kantian fanboy. I really am. And, every time I hear people talk bad about Kant, I feel bad because I had a relationship with his books, like I really gained something in my life from reading Kant. And when I hear these people, making up when I understood Kant and then I was reading other, readers like Nietzsche. So like when I'm reading like Twilight of the Idols, and now I can understand what Nietzsche's talking about, right? Because he's referencing Socrates, and I had read a load of Plato by then. I've read so much of Kant by then. So like I knew how Nietzsche is like basically belittling and insulting him, and it's, and how Heidegger like basically went into his work and kind of like kicked it around and used what he wanted to, and then kind of made up his own story about what Kant did, and then took these concepts and rolled with it. I mean, yeah, I mean, when you put all of this effort into a writer and you start to understand this writer, I mean, there's a relationship that starts forming. I mean, there's feelings attached to that. So, the fact that like philosophy is a interconnected canon itself is, I mean, man, I never could have imagined that when I started reading these books, that how it would just completely and utterly affect my life. All right. So back to this series, part one, or all of the series really. The series draws on the finest scholarly resources available today. Primary translations are from the Cambridge edition of the works of Immanuel Kant, especially the newly refined 2025 Critique of Pure Reason. And that was under Paul Geyer's general editorship. That's guiding commentaries, includes Sebastian Gardner's Routledge Philosophy Guidebook. That's like the Critique of Pure Reason. It's a walkthrough. That was released in 1999. And Paul Geyer's Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. That's from 2010. And Henry Allison. So Henry E. Allison, he wrote Kant's Transcendental Idealism, an Interpretation and Defense. So it originally came out in 1983, but was revised in 2004, which offers a definitive, epistemological reading of the two aspect distinction between phenomenon and noumenon. And we will completely get into that. And all I can say is thank God for Henry E. Allison. I mean, Paul Geyer is the Kant superhero of the world. Absolutely. He is the man when it comes to Kant. Like, he has all of his personal things, his notes, everything. I mean, he really confronted Heidegger's misprision of the transcendental idealisms. But the thing is that Henry Allison, it's like Terry Pinkard, Terry Pinkard, the way Terry Pinkard reads Hegel is he puts Hegel into reality. He takes these mystical things and he grounds them in reality. And Henry Henry E. Allison, he does the same thing for Kant. Like he looks at Kant in terms of reality. So, for instance, like the greatness of Paul Guyer is, definitely worth knowing about. But even Paul Guyer sees, the phenomenon and noumenon as two different worlds. Where Henry Allison sees phenomenon and noumenon in these are two distinctions of the same world. And I have that belief too. If we're going to talk about Kant in reality, I have that belief too, 100%. So I also want to mention I have learned immeasurably, like I said, from public lectures on YouTube, and these are of like the late Robert Paul Wolff. Is actually an absolutely outstanding lecture series. I very much recommend it. The late Michael Seguru, of course, like Michael Seguru kind of made philosophy accessible for everybody. And I think we all owe him, a debt for that. He wasn't the most clinical analyzing person, but he definitely made philosophy accessible and fun. And the late Daniel N. Robinson, and so Daniel N. Robinson's lectures, they possessed an unparalleled capacity to resurrect Kant from the dusty pages of simplifying history and present him as a towering living architecture of human thought. Robinson's profound ability to articulate the majesty of Kant's epistemology and the uncompromising dignity of his moral vision, it proved to me that these concepts are not mere historical artifacts, but urgent necessities, which are contained in our minds, and for the modern mind, that we have to learn about these things. I mean, it's our reality we're talking about here. And finally, and very much living, the last one is Victor Jespers, and he's a professor in the Netherlands. He does a complete walkthrough of the Critique of Pure Reason using Sebastian Gardner's book. So, and that isn't, it's a long series, but he walks through, I think, basically the entire book. Almost, there's one section that he skips out, and I just can't recall why that is or what it is. But if that makes you curious enough, you can actually check it out for yourself. He does an excellent, excellent job. I can tell you this: if you're going to research Kant, because I'm gonna read my essays on Kant here, but if you're going to learn, if you want the books, if you want to if you want to dive into the books, first of all, Victor Jesper is the guy to start with. You can listen to those lectures on Kant because they're very, very accessible. He explains things like Sebastian Gardner does an amazing job of reading Kant's book to you. Okay. So he's literally reading it to you. It's a walkthrough. And after you do Victor Jespers, then I would go to Robert Paul Wolff, Michael Seguru too, with Victor Jespers for sure. But then you can go to Robert Paul Wolff because Dr. or Professor Robert Paul Wolff, he really examines Kant very, very closely. And it becomes a polemic at the end, which was very surprising, which means it's a critique. It's a critique of Kant's critique. That's what it becomes at the end. And he's also an entertaining gentleman. It's too bad we lost him. But, he talks about spending 40 years with the book, right? 40 years on the Critique of Pure Reason. So, and lastly, do yourself the favor, Daniel N. Robinson. And the reason why I save him for last is because It's dense. It's very, very dense. Like if you are not already somewhat academically, in the know of Kant, and you go straight away to Daniel and Robinson, you're going to be lost. You have to have some knowing. So maybe after my podcast series, you could go to Daniel and Robinson, and and they're absolutely outstanding lectures. Absolutely outstanding. I mean, I think I've watched them like 3 times. Just completely nerd out watching Daniel and Robinson. Okay. So those books and lectures are all done by teachers who dedicated, a lot of time to Kant and to make Kant appear to speak to ordinary seekers as well as scholars. My aim is simple. I want to bring out the shadow. I want to bring Kant out of the shadows and into the light, showing why his questions remain our questions and why his answers, now illuminated by both new science and renewed theological reflection, they feel more urgent now than ever. All right. So why does Kant matter today? Have you ever wondered why we consider certain actions truly right or wrong? Or how we can claim to know anything with genuine certainty? These are the perennial questions of philosophy, and Immanuel Kant stands at the center. At first glance, Kant's writings can seem forbiddingly, abstract, yet beneath the technical surface lies a profound concern with the very structure of human experience, with reason, freedom, duty, and the dignity of persons. Examining these ideas rigorously is not an academic luxury. It is how we clarify the principles that quietly shape our laws, our sciences, our ethics, our school systems, and the sense of our own self. In this first lecture, we will trace Kant's life and intellectual development, then walk together through the major arguments of his 3 critiques. And we'll pause, at every key concept to make it as clear and concrete as possible. Along the way, we will meet the rationalists and empiricists he wrestled with, and we will prepare the ground for the remarkable convergences, with the contemporary neuroscience and the deeper theological reading that await us in part 2 and 3. So whether you are encountering Kant for the first time or returning after many years, you are in exactly the right place. So I wanted to make a brief note on Kant's language for newcomers as a reminder, and maybe a reminder for us veterans. Kant's terminology can feel intimidating, but each term carries a precise, weight load with it. A common early confusion is between transcendental and transcendence. So transcendence usually refers to something beyond ordinary experience. It's mystical, it's spiritual, or supernatural. Transcendental, in Kant's technical sense, this refers to the a priori condition that can make any experience possible at all. The hidden structures of the mind that organize sensory data into a coherent world. Other crucial terms, phenomena, noumena, synthetic a priori, categories, schematism, they will be introduced gently as we meet them, okay? So no worries. And if you really want a glossary, I can provide that for you. You can put a message down there or something, or maybe one day if I get enough followers, I can just put it up on my Patreon account. All right, so you've got this. I've got this. Let's begin. The introduction to Kant, the man and his ideas. So who was Immanuel Kant, and How did his early life and intellectual path shape the philosophy that would redefine human knowledge? Immanuel Kant was born on April 22nd, 1724, in Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, a bustling Baltic port that remained his lifelong home. The son of a modest harness maker, that's a saddler, and a deeply pious mother, Kant grew up in a household shaped by Lutheran devotion, moral rigor, and quiet industry. The pious environment, with its emphasis on inner, sincerity over external ritual, left a lasting mark. Throughout his life, Kant retained a profound sense of moral duty and human dignity that would later find secular expression in his ethics. At the age of 8, he entered the Collegium Friederichs Unionum. And I know I just butchered that, but it was a strict pietist school where Latin classes and religious instruction dominated. In 1740, at 16, he enrolled at the University of Königsberg, studying theology, mathematics, physics, and philosophy under the influence of Christian Wolff's, which would be Wolff, under Christian Wolff's rationalist system, a grand Leibnizian edifice that sought to derive all knowledge from pure reason. Though Kant would later break decisively with Wolff, this early training instilled in him a lifelong admiration for systematic rigor. After his father's death in 1746, Kant left the university without a degree to support his family as a private tutor. He returned to Königsberg in 1754, completed his doctorate in 1755, and began a long career as an unsalaried lecturer. It's a privatdocent. It was just a thing that scholars did, kind of like what I'm doing. This is like a unsalaried lecturer. For 15 years, he taught an astonishing range of subjects: logic, metaphysics, ethics, anthropology, physical geography, mathematics, and mechanics, earning a reputation as one of the university's most popular professors. Students flocked to hear the small, precise man whose lectures were clear, witty, and humane. During this period, Kant published important scientific works. His 1755 Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, it boldly proposed that the solar system formed from a rotating cloud of gas and dust collapsing under gravity, a nebular hypothesis that strikingly anticipated later developments, though Pierre-Simon Laplace would independently formulate a similar theory in 1796. Kant's version lacked modern details on angular momentum, conservation and dust-grained physics, but its speculative ambition revealed a mind unafraid to unite Newtonian mechanics with cosmological vision. In the 1760s, Kant began to distance himself from Wolffian rationalism. A pivotal moment came between 1763 and 64 when his essay for the Berlin Academy Prize competition, called Inquiry Concerning the Distinctness of the Principles of Natural Theology and Morality, it earned only second place. The prize went to Moses Mendelssohn. The Academy's critique exposed the limits of applying mathematical certainty to metaphysical questions, pushing Kant toward a more cautious approach. By 1770, at age 46, Kant secured a professorship of logic and metaphysics. Then followed what is known as his silent decade, a period of intense private reflection during which he published almost nothing. In retrospect, we can see he was dismantling the rationalist metaphysics he had once taught and forging an entirely new framework. The decisive catalyst, as Kant himself later recounted, was reading David Hume. Hume's skeptical challenge to causality, quote, "We have no rational ground to expect the future to resemble the past," close quote. This shattered Kant's confidence in traditional metaphysics and roused him. In his famous phrase from, I quote, "Dogmatic Slumber," Hume showed that the most fundamental assumptions of science and everyday life could not be justified by reason alone. Yet Kant refused to accept Hume's reduction of causality to mere psychological habit. He became convinced, there must be a deeper explanation rooted in the necessary structure of human cognition itself. Out of this decade of crisis emerged the Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, and revised 6 years later in 1787. This would be a work that would change philosophy forever. Kant's philosophy is like a vast cathedral of ideas. Its foundations are the limits and powers of human reason. Its brightly lit chambers house the principles of mathematics, science, and morality. Its shadowed recesses contain the inescapable illusions that arise when reason oversteps its bounds. His categories of understanding underpin the objectivity of modern science. His moral philosophy grounds human rights in the dignity of rational autonomy. His diagnosis of reasons, antinomies, and illusions continues to fuel debates in artificial intelligence and cognitive science. To engage with Kant is to confront both the audacity and the humility of human reason, to marvel at what we can know with the certainty, and to accept the boundaries beyond which speculation becomes illusion. His early scientific curiosity, his pious moral seriousness, his encounter with Hume, and his decade of silent reconstruction, this all converged to produce a revolutionary vision. Knowledge is not a passive mirroring of reality, but an active structuring by the mind's own forms and categories. As we move forward, we will examine how Kant critically engaged the two great opposing traditions of his time: continental rationalism, which would include thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and Wolff, and British empiricism, which would be Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. This would be clearing the ground for his own transcendental idealism. So I'm going to step into I don't know if I want to call these chapters or not, but I'm going to start talking now about Kant's critiques of Leibniz and Hume. So let's set the stage here of where this all starts to unfold. So having traced Kant's life and awakening just previously, we're now going to explore the philosophical battlefield that shaped his critical philosophy. Schooled deeply in the Leibniz Wolffian rationalist tradition of his teachers, Kant was no outsider attacking from afar. His critiques emerged from intimate knowledge. He inhabited rationalism before diagnosing its fatal flaw, and he felt the full force of Hume's imperious skepticism as a personal crisis. So the rationalist vision, which would be Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, via Wolff. Leibniz's metaphysics, mediated to Kant through Christian Wolff's systematic textbooks, It promised knowledge through reason alone. Reality consists of monads, simple, indivisible, windowless substances unfolding according to internal principles. God's perfect choice ensures pre-established harmony. Monads mirror one another without causal interaction, like clocks synchronized eternally. To understand Leibniz's monads in a simple, tangible way, forget about clocks and physics for now. We'll get to that after. Instead, imagine a massive cosmic interactive art gallery. In this gallery, there are millions of private individual rooms. These are the monads. Each room has 3 strict rules that govern how it works. The windowless room, so every room is completely sealed. There are no doors, no windows, and no vents. Nothing from the outside can ever get in, and nothing from the inside can ever get out. No one can bump into anyone else, and no one can share supplies. They are truly isolated. The infinite screen. So even though the room is sealed, every single monad room has a high definition infinite screen inside of it. This screen is constantly playing a movie, but this isn't just any movie. It is a real live, real-time feed of the entire universe seen from that specific monad's perspective. Because every monad is in a different spot. Every single monad sees a slightly different version of the same universe. Later, this would end up becoming what's called parallax, but that's for a different podcast. All right, and thirdly, the perfectly synced director. Since there are no windows and no one can communicate, you might wonder, how do all these separate rooms stay in sync? If I drop a ball in my room, how does yours know to show the ball falling too? This is where the director comes in. Leibniz argues that a perfect director, God, set up every single room at the very beginning of time. He programmed every monad's internal movie to play in perfect rhythmic harmony with every other monad. When my room's movie shows me dropping a ball, your room's movie, because of that pre-programmed sync, perfectly plays that corresponding scene of seeing a ball fall. A monad is like a private room in a massive synchronized digital art installation. You are locked inside, unable to touch or influence any other room. Yet because the entire system was designed with infinite precision at the start, your private view, which is your perception, perfectly matches the view of everyone else. Everything you perceive as interaction, bumping into a friend, catching a ball, or listening to this sentence, is actually just your monad playing its own internal movie, which happens to be perfectly choreographed to match the movies playing in every other monad in the universe. So the guiding principles include the principle of sufficient reason. Nothing occurs without a reason why it is so and not otherwise. And the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. No two substances differ only numerically. The universe is the best possible, maximally varied, yet orderly. Let's linger here for a moment because Leibniz's picture of reality is both beautiful and bold, and understanding it fully helps us feel the force of Kant's later correction. Because when I was reading about these monads, I had questions like, okay, so what are they and where are they? And to understand what and where a monad is, We have to completely break down our everyday assumptions about space, matter, and physics. Leibniz's radical claim is that physical matter and space do not actually exist as primary realities. They are illusions, or more accurately, well-founded phenomenon. If you are looking for a monad in your brain, in the air, or under a microscope, you will never find one. It would be like opening up a computer monitor and looking for the code. You're only going to find more pixels. So here's the exhaustive breakdown of what and where a monad is across linguistic, historical, theological, and literary contexts. And yes, I know this is not a Leibniz podcast, but it's, for me at least, when I was reading Kant, if I would have had this understanding to begin with, a lot more would have made sense. So, first of all, we're going to look at the linguistic context, the definition of unity. The word monad actually comes from the Greek word monas. It's derived from monos, meaning unity or alone or a single unit. In mathematics and Pythagorean philosophy, a monad was the ultimate indivisible unit of number, the number one, from which all other numbers flow. Leibniz purposely borrowed this term to emphasize that a monad is an absolute point of simplicity. So by definition, if something has a physical extension, length, width, and depth, it can be cut in half. If it can be cut in half, it is not truly simple. It is a composite made of smaller pieces. Therefore, the fundamental building blocks of reality cannot be physical. A monad is a metaphysical point, not a physical point. Think of it as a localized center of force or consciousness. It's completely devoid of physical size. And the historical context, the rejection of atomism. To understand what a monad is, we must look at who Leibniz, we have to look at Leibniz was who he was arguing against in the late 17th and 18th centuries. And that was against material atomism, Democritus, Gassendi, even Newton himself. Materialists argued that the world is made of tiny, hard, physical marbles called atoms, floating in empty space. Leibniz declared this logically impossible. If an atom is physical, it takes up space. If it takes up space, it is theoretically divisible, meaning it isn't an atom, which means uncuttable. And against the Cartesian dualism of Descartes, René Descartes split the world into two things: mind, the res cogitans, and matter, extension, res extensa. Leibniz realized this created a massive puzzle. How can an unextended mind push around extended physical matter, like your brain signaling your arm? So Leibniz's brilliant radical solution was to eliminate res extensa entirely. To Leibniz, I can't decide whether I want to call him Leibniz or Leibniz. It's just go with me on this, okay? But for Leibniz, everything is mind. Material objects like rocks, brains, and air particles, they're just aggregate collections of these non-physical mind-like monads. A rock is like a cloud of dust. From far away, it looks like a solid physical object, but as you get closer, it resolves into billions of individual non-physical centers of perception. All right, and let's look at the theological and ontological context. Like, what and where are they? So what is a monad? And, it's It's an entelechy of perception. If a monad isn't matter, what is it made of? And Leibniz states it is made of two things: perception and appetition, appetitus. Perception, the internal state of the monad representing external things. So the internal state of the monad is representing external things. Every monad is a mirror of the entire universe. We were talking about that, right? Like all the different rooms, but every monad, we see the same thing happen in all the different rooms. And appetition, the internal drive or force that moves the monad from one perception to the next, the unfolding of its internal movie. Leibniz classifies monads into a strict hierarchy based on the clarity of their perceptions. So the simple bare monads, these have completely unconscious, foggy perceptions, perceptions and sensibles. The matter we see, like air particles, water, or dirt, is actually composed of these sleeping, unconscious monads. They are alive in a metaphysical sense, but lack memory or awareness. Secondly, we have soul monads. So these possess memory and distinct perceptions. Animals have these. 3, there is spirit rational monads. These possess apperception, so self-consciousness, and logical reasoning. This is what your human soul mind is, the spiritual rational monads. And the monad of monads, God, the ultimate infinite monad that perceives everything with absolute perfection and clarity simultaneously. So where is a monad? Where are they? And this is the illusion of space. To ask where a monad is assumes that space is a giant container, like a room, and the monad is inside of it. But Leibniz completely rejects this concept, known as absolute space. Instead, Leibniz argues that space is relative. Space is nothing more than the order of coexistence of things. The analogy of a family tree, like where is the family relationship located physically? It isn't anywhere, right? It's just a conceptual framework that maps how individuals relate to one another. So similarly, like monads do not exist in space. Space exists inside the monads. Because your monad perceives other monads as being far or near according to its internal program, you experience the illusion of spatial distance. Therefore, are they in your brain? No. Your brain is a composite appearance generated by the collective perception of monads. Your mind monad doesn't sit in the pineal gland. It is fundamentally non-spatial. And are they particles in the air? I mean, that's a fair question, right? Like, air particles are not monads themselves. They are a phenomenon, right? They're produced by collections of trillions of bare monads vibrating in perceptual harmony. What about the literary and conceptual synthesis? So if we were to translate Leibniz's ontology into modern literary or conceptual frameworks to make it graspable, a monad is best understood not as a thing, but as a perspective, I guess, or a line of a code. Imagine the universe as a massive multiplayer video game like The Matrix. If you look at an object in the game, say a sword lying on the ground, you might ask, what is that physical sword made of? If you zoom in infinitely on the screen, you don't find iron or steel. You find lines of code running on a server. The code itself doesn't have a weight. It doesn't have a color, and it doesn't occupy physical space inside the computer. Yet it dictates exactly how the sword behaves, how it looks, and how players interact with it. Each monad is an independent piece of that divine software. They aren't anywhere physically because physicality is the output of the code, not the input. The entire physical world, from the neurons firing in your skull to the wind blowing through the trees, is the collective. It's synchronized rendering of these spiritual points of force. And just to recap what we were talking about earlier. So if we ask Leibniz, why did God arrange it this way? Leibniz would tell us because of the two big principles that he thought reason alone could discover. And we'll just go over these again I'll flush this out a little bit more this time. So if you remember, number one was the principle of sufficient reason. There must always be a reason why something is one way and not another. Nothing happens by pure chance. If the universe were chaotic or were arbitrary, there would be no sufficient reason for it to exist at all. And secondly, the principle of the best. Among all possible universes that God could have created, he chose the one with the greatest variety of things and the greatest overall perfection, the best of all possible worlds. Now, this also explains why evil and suffering exist. They are necessary shadows that make the overall picture brighter. A world with no contrast, no struggle, nothing to overcome. This would be a world less rich than the one with courage, compassion, and triumph. And that may be something that really seems to have influenced Schelling. Leibniz's system is optimistic and deeply rational. Everything has a reason. Everything fits together in divine harmony. And pure thinking can uncover these truths without needing messy experiments or sensory data. It's like solving the entire puzzle of existence with logic alone. Yet, and this is where Kant steps in, this breathtaking logical edifice rests on the assumption that the way reason connects ideas inside our heads must match the way things actually connect in reality. And Kant will argue that this is a leap too far. Kant's response in the Amphibole of Concepts of Reflection, and you can find this in the Critique of Pure Reason, A260 through 292, and B316 through 349. Kant identifies a subtle but decisive confusion at the heart of rationalism. Leibniz and his followers mistook logical relations among concepts for real relations among sensible objects. They were seduced by the idea that because their logic was perfect, the world must be perfectly logical in the same way. Imagine sitting in a perfectly sealed, windowless room, equipped only with the flawless rules of mathematics and logic, attempting to deduce the weather outside. You might conclude that because a storm represents chaos and your equations are perfectly balanced, the sky must be clear. This is the illusion of the armchair. As Immanuel Kant warned us in the Amphibole of Concepts of Reflection, this is precisely the subtle but decisive trap that snared Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and his rationalist disciples. They mistook the pristine logical relations among concepts for the messy, real relations among sensible objects. Seduced by the perfection of their own logic, they assumed the universe must reflect that same logical perfection. Leibniz attempted to deduce the fundamental structure of reality, the nature of substance and force, entirely from the comfort of his armchair, using pure reason. But conflating the logical rules of thought with the metaphysical structure of reality is a fatal error. He treated space and time as merely confused concepts, a mental shorthand for logical derivatives, unable to imagine they could be anything more. Let us step out of the armchair and explore the specific avenues where Kant beautifully illustrates how pure logic blinded a genius to the physical world. The missing step of transcendental reflection. Where do our ideas live before we compare them? If we are to ask whether two concepts are identical or different, inner or outer, we must first establish the soil from which they grow. Kant explicitly named the mechanism of Leibniz error. He bypassed a vital process called transcendental reflection. Kant argued that before we can compare concepts, we must first ask which cognitive faculty they belong to, sensibility or understanding. Leibniz skipped this essential step entirely. He weighed and measured objects using nothing but the pure understanding. As Kant brilliantly framed it, Leibniz intellectualized the appearances, just as John Locke had sensitized the concepts of understanding, rather than recognizing sensibility as a distinct, irreducible source of knowledge. Leibniz dismissed it as merely a confused kind of representation. The two drops of water, identity versus difference. So picture holding two perfectly spherical, chemically identical drops of water. To the pure intellect, devoid of physical space, these two drops are indistinguishable. They share every conceivable property. Analyzing objects through purely logical concepts led Leibniz to his famous principle of the identity of indiscernibles. He concluded that if two things share the exact same conceptual properties, they must be the exact same object. Yet our own eyes tell us there are two distinct drops. How can this be? Kant dismantles Leibniz's failing armchair logic by reintroducing space, the very realm of sensibility. Kant argued that two drops of water can be completely identical conceptually, sharing all the same properties, yet remain numerically distinct simply because they occupy different locations in space. Space and time, Kant reminds us, it does the vital work of individuating objects, not just logic. The retreat inward, the creation of the monad. If we strip away the physical world, what remains of a thing's essence? When we remove the scaffolding of space, we are left searching for an anchor. In the strict realm of logic, a substance must possess an inner reality that does not depend on any outer relations. Because Leibniz treated space merely as a confused logical relation, he effectively stripped reality of all physical spatial relations, such as shape, contact, and motion. Stripped of all physical extension, what could this inner state possibly be? Leibniz could conceive of only one, the state of a mind, specifically the state of having representations. This was driven entirely by a deception of transcendental reflection. Leibniz was forced to conclude that the fundamental building blocks of the universe were simple, thinking, non-spatial subjects he called monads. From this armchair, the physical universe logically dissolves into a chorus of disembodied minds. The denial of real conflict, the agreement versus the opposition. So consider the nature of physical conflict. In the realm of pure thought, can two truths destroy one another? In pure logic, two positive affirmations, two realities, can never contradict one another. Contradiction only happens when you pair a positive with a negative. Viewing reality strictly through this pure logical lens, Leibniz concluded that the real conflict was impossible, giving rise to his vision of a perfectly harmonious universe. This blinded him to the physical realities of nature. Kant countered this harmonious illusion by demonstrating that in the sensible world, two positive realities can absolutely oppose and cancel each other out. Picture two equal physical forces colliding and moving in opposite directions, resulting in a sudden state of rest. Logic alone simply cannot account for physical opposition. And why does this matter? Navigating this section will be about navigating the lived world. We can tie these threads together to see the profound implications of Kant's critique. Leibniz, he successively built a perfectly consistent, logically rigorous system. However, it was an intellectual system of the world, designed for a universe of pure thought, completely divorced from the spatio-temporal world we actually inhabit. By demoting space and time to mere byproducts of logic, Leibniz blinded himself to the fundamental truth that sensibility operates by its own unique rules. Rules that pure reason can never deduce from an armchair. We cannot think our way to reality. We must synthesize the undeniable structure of logic with friction, space, and time of the physical world. Leibniz built a magnificent castle in the air, but as Kant showed us, it was entirely unmoored from the earth. Yet recognizing the necessity of the sensible world, the friction of physical space and time opens the door to a new and perhaps more terrifying problem. If we abandon the armchair of pure reason and look exclusively to our senses for truth, what actually remains? If we swing the pendulum violently from pure relationalism to pure empiricism, will we find solid ground? Not really. We more or less find an abyss. To understand the true stakes of Kant's monumental project, we must leave the German rationalists behind, cross the English Channel, and confront a man who threatened to quietly dismantle human knowledge altogether. This was the empiricist challenge, David Hume. If all knowledge must come from experience, can we ever truly know anything for certain? David Hume approached this question with a skepticism that was gentle, charming, and absolutely devastating. He did not attack the fringes of philosophy. He struck at the very core of how we navigate reality. He undermined not only our specific beliefs, but the very concepts of necessity and universality. Consider tomorrow's sunrise. So we have watched the sun crest the horizon thousands of times. So we just, confidently expect it to warm our faces again tomorrow. But what guarantees this? Hume looked at our daily assumptions and delivered a startling verdict. Absolutely nothing rational guarantees it. As Hume observed, we never actually witness a necessary connection forcing the sun to rise. We merely experience a constant conjunction, one event following into another, over and over until the mind forms a psychological habit. There is no logical contradiction in imagining the sun failing to rise tomorrow. We expect the future to resemble the past, not because reason demands it, but because we are creatures of habit. Hume dismantles causality with equal precision. So in his example, picture two billiard balls colliding on a green felt table. We watch the cue ball strike the 8 ball, and we see the 8 ball roll away. We instinctively assume the first forced the second to move. But Hume warned us that we are hallucinating this necessity. We see the sequence, the striking, the sound, the subsequent motion, but we never observe the invisible glue of cause. The feeling of necessity is not a physical feature of the universe. It is a psychological feature added by our own minds after repeated exposure. Custom, as Hume famously concluded, is the great guide of human life, not reason. When we turn this relentless empiricism inward, the results are even more disorientating. What of the observer? What of you? When we search our inner lives for a permanent, enduring I, what do we find? Hume showed us that we never catch a unified, continuous self. We find only a fleeting stream of perceptions, a sudden memory, a flash of anger, the sensation of a cold breeze coming and going in rapid succession. The self dissolves into a mere bundle of passing impressions, tied loosely together by memory. The grand metaphysical idea of substance is unmasked as a convenient fiction. This is not merely an academic puzzle. It is an existential threat to the foundations of human inquiry. Hume was a cheerful skeptic who lived calmly, but by common sense. Philosophically, he demonstrated that reason alone cannot justify the basic beliefs that keep us alive. If he is right, the unbreakable laws of physics are reduced to mere habits of thought. The enduring soul is a mirage. Science rests on custom, and metaphysics is an illusion. It was exactly this quiet catastrophe, this gentle demolition of certainty, that provoked the greatest philosophical revolution of the modern era. As Kant famously as he confessed, it was the objection of David Hume that first, many years ago, interrupted his dogmatic slumber. The ultimate question now stood before us. How can we rescue the certainty of science, mathematics, and our own rational agency from the jaws of this relentless doubt? The synthetic a priori. So, Kant conceded Hume's point. We do not observe necessity itself. Yet he transformed the problem. Necessity arises not from objects or habit, but from the mind's a priori contribution. Causality, substance, and other categories are synthetic a priori judgments. They expand knowledge, yet hold universally and necessarily as conditions of possible experience. So let me give you an analogy. In the billiard strike, your mind does not passively register sequence. It actively applies cause to bind events into coherent order. Without this, experience fragments. And I want to talk about this common modern analogy and the limits to this analogy, because every course that I took, or even in lectures, the lecturer or the teacher is going to bring up this type of metaphor, and it's about transcendental idealism is often illustrated by the metaphor of unremovable glasses or tinted spectacles. So it says we see the world through cognitive lenses, okay, space, time, categories. But we cannot take these lenses off. So reality appears filtered and things in themselves remain hidden. This analogy, popular in 20th and 21st century introductions, with no single originator traced, just variations appear widely in Anglo-American commentary. But this popular analogy captures the mind's structuring role usefully for beginners, yet it misleads in a crucial way. It suggests our cognitive apparatus is an external appendage, something added onto a neutral perception that we might hypothetically remove. And Kant insists otherwise. Space, time, and categories are not they're not sunglasses. They're not anything that could ever be detachable tools. These are innate faculties of human cognition itself, integral to our finite sensibility and understanding. And we will see in part 2 of this Kant series how contemporary neuroscience, drawing on it's called lattice, as in Lattice, lattice physics, and in entorhinal hippocampal mapping, entorhinal, entorhinal, hippocampal mapping reveals these forms and categories as biological structures, literally they're hardwire into us, into the navigating brain. They're not optional overlays. So the novel synthesis, the transcendental idealism, Kant does not average rationalism and empiricism. He regrounds both on transcendental conditions. He grants empiricists that all knowledge begins with experience, but insists against them that it does not all arise from experience. He curbs rationalist overreach by confining knowledge to appearances, that's phenomenon, while preserving the active role of reason within those bounds. So things in themselves, that's noumena, they remain unknowable, not as skeptical despair, but as critical humility. Kant's engagement with his predecessors cleared the ground for a revolutionary proposal. As we move forward, we examine its heart, the Copernican experiment of reversing the traditional assumption, asking not how our cognition conforms to objects, but how objects might conform to our cognition. Before we move on, let us pause here together and linger over these central terms. Pay very close attention to their precise meanings, for they are the load-bearing pillars of Kant's entire edifice. A small misunderstanding at this stage can send later interpretations wildly off course, just as we will see, which has happened throughout philosophy's subsequent history. Rationalism is the conviction that genuine knowledge can be secured through reason alone, completely independent of sensory experience, like solving an intricate puzzle using only the power of thought and logic, without needing to touch the pieces. Empiricism, by contrast, insists that all knowledge originates in sensory experience, like learning about the world by seeing, touching, hearing, tasting, and smelling, building understanding only from what the senses deliver. Monads are Leibniz's proposed fundamental units of reality, simple, indivisible, windowless substances that unfold according to their own internal program, coordinated by divine pre-established harmony, like perfectly synchronized clocks that never interact and always agree. And a fibule, this is Kant's term, and a fibule occurs when we confuse purely logic or conceptual relations with real relations among objects in the sensible world, like mistaking a detailed map for the actual territory it represents. Causality is the necessary connection by which one event brings about another, like pressing a button and the light reliably turning on. Not by chance or by habit alone, but because the mind imposes this blinding rule. Synthetic a priori judgments are truths that expand our knowledge, synthetic, yet hold universally and necessarily without requiring experience. A priori, like knowing before an observation that every event must have a cause. Transcendental idealism is Kant's core insight. Our minds actively structure experience through innate forms and categories. So we know things only as they appear to us. This is the phenomenon. Never as they might utterly independent, how they might be utterly independent of our cognitive faculties. So that means like we see the world that our brain is made for us to see. We don't see the world as it actually really is. Like the shapes and the colors all around us may not actually be the way that we interpret them. Phenomenon are precisely those things as they appear to us, shaped by space, time, and the categories, forming the coherent world of everyday objects and scientific laws. Before we proceed into the core of Kant's critical project, a crucial and formidable warning must be sounded concerning what is arguably the most perilous, persistently misunderstood, and philosophically explosive of all his central terms, the noumenon, what Kant referred to as things in themselves, Ding and sich. Let us begin with the word itself, noumenon. Noumenon comes from an ancient Greek noumenon. I can't even pronounce this, even though I've got it phonetically here. Noiomenon. Okay, something like that. Meaning literally that which is thought, or the object of thinking. The verb, noin, to perceive with the mind alone. The definition is deceptively simple. But trying to simplify this word for impossibility is what taints it. If I were to explain this to a 12-year-old as the door that can never be opened or the boundary, what we are doing is producing images that lead people to imagine there's something behind a thick locked door that you can never open or peek through. The explanation of the noumenon has to completely evade metaphors, because metaphors give subtle indications that you can imagine there's something there, like a secret world or where the ultimate truth is. But you have no way to know what it looks like, feels like, or truly is. That's not the noumenon. That's an illusion. The noumenon is the bare thought of a reality considered completely apart from how our minds and senses shape everything we experience. The real problem is our minds actually make it impossible to imagine nothing, because anything that has a placeholder of value can be manipulated by the imagination, what puts us in this loop of regression. The word noumenon itself is easy enough to say and even to picture in this limited way. Yet the real difficulty, the profound challenge, is not understanding the term. Now, hear me out here. It is not about understanding the term, but instead we are asked to truly accept what it demands. And that means intellectual surrender at reason's border, a full stop where all conceptual grasping must end. No matter what we imagine reality to be, perfect sources of goodness, beauty, justice, dreams of ultimate truth, divine presence, we can never conceptually know it as anything beyond our mind's manufactured constructions. The garbage can lay on the curb, the tree in the yard, the love you feel for someone, the pictures you paint, the music that moves you, all reside in phenomenon, shaped inescapably by our own cognitive faculties. Biologically, we have no evidence of ideas existing outside this finite, embodied framing. Everything knowable is our communal constructions. This isn't about mystical realms. It's about everything. The tree, love, art, music, all are pulled back into the phenomenal sphere. This recognition carries a tragic weight. It reveals the bounded nature of human cognition, its inescapable finitude of our flesh and bones. Yet herein lies Kant's profound paradigm for true faith. Not the Platonic faith in relational assent to unknowable forms that are guiding life, but a practical faith standing humbly at the limit. Theoretical reason stops. Practical reason postulates freedom, immortality. God is necessary for moral life. Faith beyond knowledge, grounded in duty rather than speculative grasp. Faith becomes a lived experience and leaves behind the ideology of what it will do for us, but rather what we must do in this life for our mutual being amongst beings. Hold this tightly. The noumenon is not a door to open or a realm to enter. For us, it is the end of reality, the negative thought that enforces reason's humility. And that is, to be quite honest, that is actually a branch of Harry Allison's thinking of the phenomenon noumenon, where Paul Guyer actually sees that it is two worlds, that there could be a mystery, where God may reside in the noumenon. And I mean, this is something I will deeply go into, because it's a lot of how, Kant's work was it was the way it was transfigured to create so many different other philosophies, or to enhance the philosophical projects of Schelling, Fichte, Schopenhauer, Hegel, Heidegger. I mean, this entire thing we're talking about here, it has so many historical branches that we will get into later on. All right, the philosophical landscape that Kant inherited. So, to fully appreciate the revolutionary and ultimately restrictive nature of this idea, we must first recall the philosophical landscape that Kant inherited and sought to navigate. For millennia, the Western metaphysical tradition, exemplified most powerfully by Plato's doctrine of the forms or ideas, that sought to locate ultimate reality in a transcendent, immutable realm of pure essences. These forms, perfect, eternal archetypes like beauty itself, justice itself, or the good, these were held to be more real than the flickering shadows of the sensory world, accessible not through unreliable senses, but through rigorous rational dialectic and philosophical assent. The forms were meant to guide human life, though unknowable in direct sensory terms. The rational intuition provided the faith-based compass for ethics, politics, and the soul's orientation towards truth. Plato's appeal was profoundly logical, yet rooted in ideological faith. To Socrates and Plato, the visible world is a low-resolution illusion of the true reality that lies beyond the veil of death. And this is glimpsed by reason's disciplined vision of concepts. This tradition echoed through later thinkers. Aristotle's more immanent forms, still metaphysical substances, Descartes' clear and distinct ideas as innate divine guarantees, Spinoza's single infinite substance known through a relational intellectual love of God, all shared the conviction that reason could pierce beyond appearance to grasp hidden elements in ultimate being. Yet by Kant's time, modern science's empirical triumphs and Hume's skeptical demolition has exposed the fragility of such claims. Ungrounded speculations collapsing into empirical mythology and ontic fantasy. Kant felt compelled to reground metaphysics in the secure certainties of human experience, establishing rigorous foundations for Newtonian physics and mathematics, while demonstrating reason's absolute limits, thereby making room for faith without dogmatic overreach. So the noumena is a critical boundary concept. Kant earned the nickname Alzheimer, the all-crusher, or great destroyer of metaphysics, precisely because he welded, rationality to demolish speculative excesses. The noumenon is his sharpest weapon, not an invitation to transcend, but a prohibitive boundary. We must handle the term with extraordinary, even surgical care. Kant introduces the nomenon not as thrilling esoteric access to hidden reality, graspable through non-sensory intuition. The opposite is true. It functions as a critical finitude, Grenzebegriff, a stern reminder that legitimate knowledge confines itself only to appearances, phenomenon. These objects structured by space and time and categories like causality and substance. The noumena signifies the thought of an object stripped of these conditions, a pure negativity marking reason's edge. Imagine driving at full speed towards an invisible wall. The noumenon is that wall. Crash into it with speculative claims, and your metaphysical vehicle, it will shatter. The limit instantly halts progress. The intellect feels suffocated, oxygen removed, ego diminished. No wonder philosophical temperaments resist when confronted with nothingness beyond the knowable. Imagination rushes in, creating metaphysical cushions, producing illusions to confront the impossibility of nothingness, blending emptiness into familiar shapes. But we have to truly understand that these cushions we create for the collision with reality is exactly the reason we have driven eternally into despair. The post-Kantian philosophical chaos, and I'm going to touch on this here, the boundary concept intended as a metaphor for intellectual humility, unexpectedly triggered centuries of chaos. Instead of promoting modesty, it was misinterpreted as a mystical beyond, ripe for conquest, which in turn, it ignited a fever of speculative historical theorizing, like the destructive potential of atomic science weaponized for war rather than harnessed for illumination and energy. The concept of the noumenon was, in a strange twist of intellectual fate, a catalyst for philosophical excesses and despair, rather than a force for the critical restraint Kant had intended. Kant's original purpose was to delineate the firm boundaries of human reason, establishing that we can only have knowledge of the phenomenal world, the world of experience and appearances. We must remain agnostic about the noumenal world, the thing in itself that lies beyond possible experience. The noumenon was not meant to be a cautionary fence, a permanent marker separating legitimate empirical inquiry from illegitimate transcendental speculation. The profound irony is that this very tool, which was conceived as an instrument of intellectual modesty and humility, ultimately became the engine for unbounded metaphysical claims and unrestrained system building. Post-Kantian thinkers, feeling constrained by the limits Kant had imposed, often sought to breach or co-opt the noumenon, using it as a springboard for grand speculative philosophies that claimed access to ultimate reality, thus entirely contradicting the critical spirit of the original concept. And I will definitely thoroughly examine this topic in part 2. I'm beating it to death a little bit here because I really want you to carry this with you as we move on. So, regrounding the limit in cognitive biology. In part 2, fresh eyes in contemporary neuroscience dissolve these misprisions, okay? Grounding limits in embodied brain biology reveals the beyond, not as mystical darkness, but finite architecture's boundary, evolutionary necessity for survival, honoring Kant's humility while stripping speculative drama. The noumena becomes objective fact about species-specific cognition, not a tragic limit, but sober recognition that our reality is constructed map, not passive window onto ultimate truth. The problem is not understanding the word as much as the problem of accepting it. Hold these definitions close as we proceed. They will light our path through the heart of the critique. And I just want to mention here before we go on to the next point, this is exactly what reading Kant is like. It's like you enter into a labyrinth, and as you move through his writings, it opens up to you and opens up and opens up. And it's really in the rereading, it's in the thinking that these terminologies and these concepts become graspable. So if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed at this point, this is all part of the process. It's all part of the journey. I mean, truly understanding Kant is wrestling with his works. So, I mean, for me, I created this series not only because I have an opinion and my own opinions based on what I've learned, but also because I want to help you understand these terms and what you're up against as you go through this labyrinth of thought and truly enlightenment. So let's talk about the Copernican revolution. So this becomes the mind at the center. So Kant's revolutionary correction asserts that space and time are not logical, derivations at all. They are the primary, a priori forms of intuition provided by the mind itself. We do not think our way into space and time. We already occupy them. Because our minds are finite, they do not just mirror reality, they impose the grid of space and time onto the raw chaos of sensation. So Leibniz attempted to derive the world top-down, from abstract logic to reality. Kant demonstrates that we must understand it from the bottom up, starting with how our sensibility structures experience. A perfect logical blueprint of harmony, no matter how elegant, cannot guarantee that the actual world conforms to it. By identifying this confusion, Kant decisively halts the rationalist project, declaring that pure reason cannot transcend our sensory limits to grasp monads or things in themselves. We cannot know the world as it appears to us, the phenomenon. We can never know it, know what it really is. We are permanently barred from knowing reality as it exists independently of our cognitive framework. So the crisis and the reversal. So before Kant, philosophy trapped in a stalemate. You had empiricists like Locke and Hume, They argued the mind as a passive recipient of sensory data, a blank slate gradually filled by experience, or a camera simply recording impressions. And then you had rationalists like Descartes and Leibniz, argued the mind contains innate ideas, a pre-programmed system capable of deducing truths independently of the senses. Both camps, however, shared one fatal assumption: that knowledge must conform to objects. Our minds were mirrors, tasked with reflecting a pre-existing external world as accurately as possible. Kant saw this assumption and led straight to Hume's devastating, skepticism. It acknowledges just a copy of objects that we can never step outside our minds to compare the copy with the original. Then certainty evaporates. Causality becomes mere habit. Like we said, we expect the sun to rise because it always has. Substance dissolves. The self is just a bundle of fleeting perceptions, and even science resists on shaky psychological associations. Kant's bold solution was to reverse the assumption entirely. In the most famous passage of the Critique of Pure Reason, he proposes a thought experiment. Quote, "Hitherto, it has been assumed that all cognition must conform to the objects. Let us try whether we do not get farther with metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition," close quote. And this is Kant's revolutionary wager. What if the lawful order we experience in the world is not discovered out there, but imposed by the necessary structures of our own minds? What if objects as we know them must conform to the way human cognition works? So the full story, I want to go through the full story of the Copernican analogy, from calendar crisis to the cosmic reversal. So later scholars dubbed this Kant's Copernican revolution. Kant himself never used that exact phrase. Instead, he described it as a change in thinking, analogous to the first thoughts of Copernicus. So let us tell that astronomical story in full, for it illuminates Kant's move with dramatic clarity. In the early 16th century, the Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar, had drifted seriously out of sync with the solar year. Over centuries, the calculated dates of equinoxes and solstices, it shifted, causing the crucial Christian holiday of Easter, tied to the spring equinox and Passover, to fall later and later. By the 1510s, the error was about 10 days, disrupting religious observance across Europe. In 1512 and 1517, Pope Leo X convened the Fifth Lantern Council and called on Europe's astronomers to propose a fix. And if you're inside of my Heidegger series, this is we speak about this, the Fifth Lantern Council. So Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish canon and mathematician, was consulted, though he declined direct participation, citing insufficient data. He had long puzzled over the dominant polemic system: Earth motionless as the universe's center, with sun, moon, planets, and stars orbiting it. This was the old way to explain the planet's observed motions, especially their occasional backward loops against the stars, retrograde motion. Ptolemy's followers added dozens of smaller circles, epicycles, atop larger ones. The model worked for predictions, but grew hopelessly complex and inelegant. Copernicus performed a radical thought experiment. What if the reverse, the central assumption, what if the sun, not Earth, stands relatively still at the center? and Earth itself moves, orbiting the sun while rotating on its axis. The results were astonishing. Retrograde motion, previously requiring convoluted epicycles, now emerged simply. When Earth, on its faster inner orbit, overtakes an outer planet like Mars, Mars appears to loop backward against the fixed stars, just as a faster train passing a slower one makes the slower train seem to move backward relative to the landscape. The precision of the equinoxes, key to calendar drift, also simplified dramatically under heliocentrism. Most importantly, astronomy became a true science, objective, mathematical laws held independently of any particular observer's position. Every observer on the moving Earth would measure the same relative motions and derive the same universal laws, precisely because the observer's own motion was factored in rather than assumed away. Kant saw in this reversal a perfect parallel for philosophy. Just as Copernicus explained apparent celestial disorder by accounting for the observer's active contribution, that's the Earth's motion, Kant proposed explaining the order as lawfulness of experience by accounting for the subject's active contribution, the mind's structures. And just as heliocentrism yielded universal objectivity despite the observer's motion, Kant's reversal yields universal objectivity despite the mind's structuring role, because every rational mind shares the same structures. One final note on the analogy. It is not perfect, and Kant knew that. Copernicus decentered humanity, cosmically. Kant, in a profoundly humanistic gesture, recenters the human mind as constitutive of the knowable world. The comparison highlights the methodological reversal, explaining order by reference to the observer subject, while reminding us, unlike Copernicus, we cannot claim knowledge of reality independent of that contribution. The mind's machinery, sensibility, understanding, reason. Immanuel Kant's philosophical revolution hinges on distinguishing three distinct yet interdependent faculties of the mind that calibrate to construct our experience of reality. 1, the sensibility, 2, the understanding, and 3, the reason. So sensibility, understanding, and reason. The interaction between these three faculties defines the limits and possibilities of human knowledge. So let's talk about sensibility. This is the passive receiver. In Kantian critical philosophy, the faculty of sensibility, that's the Sinnlichkeit, is the foundational passive component of human cognition. It is defined as the mind's receptive capacity to be affected by objects. Those objects which are ultimately external to us, and the resultant state of this affection is the generation of a sensory representation, which Kant terms an intuition, Anschauung. In the Paul Guyer translation, this stage marks the absolute beginning of all knowledge, in whatever manner and by whatever means a cognition may relate to objects. The manner through which it relates to them immediately is intuition. A crucial insight of Kant's transcendental aesthetic is that the raw sensory data, or the manifold, does not present itself to the mind as a chaotic, unorganized deluge of unconnected sensations, a pure jumble of unlinked colors, unrelated sounds, and isolated pressures. Instead, sensibility is not merely passive. It immediately and necessarily structures as incoming raw data using two inherent non-empirical cognitive frameworks, the a priori forms of intuition, which are space and time. As Professor Dan Robinson often underscored in his lectures, these forms are not general concepts or features abstracted from experience. Rather, they are the immutable, built-in cognitive presets, the very conditions that make experience itself possible. They are the innate faculties of cognition which we must necessarily view reality. The first of these is space, and space is the indispensable external form of intuition. Its primary function is to allow us to synthesize and locate sensations externally, providing the answer to the fundamental question of where. Kant argues for the necessity of this form. All perceptions we hold of objects outside of ourselves are necessarily framed within a spatial relationship, such as being next to, above, below, or separate from one another. We are cognitively incapable of conceiving an external material object that is non-spatial. Furthermore, space is an a priori precondition imposed by the mind, not an attribute derived from observing. Things in themselves, it serves as the necessary foundation for the universal and apodictic. So apodictic means necessarily true. These are the necessary truths of geometry. The geometric laws of Euclidean space. So, I'll get into this deeper too as we go, but the geometric laws of Euclidean space, such as the shortest distance between 2 points being a straight line, are certain because they flow directly from the mind's own framework for perceiving the external world. The second form, time. Time is indispensable, is an indispensable internal form of intuition. Its function is to order all mental states sequentially, answering the fundamental question of when. Time poses a unique universality. It is the primary and fundamental framework for all inner experience. This includes not just sensations, but also thoughts, feelings, volitions, and even the products of the understanding, such as concepts and judgments. Everything that constitutes our awareness is fundamentally a constituent of the flow of time. This is not the same way that you would monitor time on a clock. Kant used time as a primordial and inescapable ordering principle. While we might attempt to imagine non-spatial states, such as pure abstract thoughts, we cannot conceive of any mental event that exists outside of a temporal sequence. Essentially, time is occurrence of anything. Like A to B, there's time. Time is what exists between them. Even the thought of A and B, like not traveling from the store to your house. Yes, time happens between that. But even thinking A to B, time is created there. The fact that space and time are structures imposed by the mind and not properties of things in themselves leads directly to Kant's doctrine of transcendental idealism. These forms are the necessary preconditions for having any coherent, identifiable experience at all. Without a structured where and a sequential when, experience would remain an impossible, undifferentiated buzz. Consequently, the truths based on these forms of intuition, specifically the synthetic a priori, knowledge found in geometry and arithmetic, the later being based on successive syntheses and ordering of units in time, they apply only to the world as it appears to us, the phenomenon. They do not and cannot apply to the noumena, the world of things as they exist independently of our perception. This limitation is the core of Kant's critical project. Our knowledge is universally and necessarily true, but it is bounded by the very structure of our cognitive faculties. Now, I realize we're coming up on the 2 hour mark here, so I am going to finish the two parts. Number two, the understanding, the mind's lawgiver and the architect of experience. This is the active synthesizer. The understanding, Verstand, in contrast to its passive receptivity of sensibility, is the mind's spontaneous, active, and unifying faculty. Its fundamental purpose is to take the raw manifold of sensory intuition, which sensibility has already ordered merely in the subjective forms of space and time, and it actively synthesizes this data. It weaves this material into unified, coherent, and objectively knowable objects and events that can become the subject of higher order cognitive functions like judgment and reason. The understanding doesn't simply wait for experience, it proactively structures it, thereby making experience intelligible in the first place. The tools by which the understanding performs this essential synthesis are the 12 categories of the understanding, or pure concepts. These categories are not derived from experience, rather, they are the fixed innate rules, the necessary grammar, or the of a priori structure. This is what the mind imposes on any possible experience. They function as the necessary conditions for the possibility of objective knowledge and universal validity. Without these concepts, experience would be nothing more than the private, chaotic flux of fleeting sensations. It would be impossible to share or verify. They guarantee that the world as we experience it is a lawful, predictable, and shared reality. These categories are systematically grouped into four distinct classes, each performing a specific function in structuring experience. The first class, quantity, comprising unity, plurality, and totality. This allows the mind to synthesize given data into countable, measurable wholes and sets. The second, quality, reality, negation, and limitation. The quality determines the sensory content of a perception as something existing, something absent, or a mixture of both. The third class, relation, that's substance, accident, cause, effect, community, reciprocity. This establishes objective relationships and persistence across the time among phenomenon. And finally, the class of modality, possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, and necessity, matched with contingency. Modality determines the mode of or status of a judgment concerning its relation to the mind and experience. The action of the understanding is best illustrated by its imposition of these relational categories, which transform subjective perceptions into objective knowledge. One primary example is the establishment of objective persistence. Through the category of substance and accident, consider an apple, the empirical data registered by the senses. Its color, size, texture, and taste is constantly changing. As the apple ripens, is bruised, or is eaten, these sensory properties or accidents, they fluctuate. However, the understanding spontaneously applies the category of substance. This compels the mind to experience the varying sensory input as belonging to one and the same persisting subject, the apple, that remains identical to itself beneath the changing appearances, rather than perceiving a disjointed, chaotic, and unrelated series of impressions. It is the concept of substance, supplied a priori, that confers permanence and identity onto the phenomenon. A second critical function is the establishment of necessary connection to the category of causality and dependence. When we observe two events, such as a billboard ball striking another, followed by the second ball moving, we do not simply register a subjective one after another sequence of events. Instead, the understanding spontaneously applies the category of causality. It forces us to experience the first event as the necessary cause of the second, establishing an objective, irreversible sequence. This universal and necessary connection is a rule supplied by the mind as an a priori law. It is not something we could ever logically derive or empirically verify from raw sensations alone. As we all truly observe is the sequence itself, not the necessity of the connection. Furthermore, the understanding creates structured wholes, and I don't mean HOL, I mean whole as in like 4 quarters make a whole. So understanding does create structured wholes through the categories of quantity. When viewing a group of items, such as 3 apples on a table, the mind does not perceive 3 unrelated pieces of sense data. Instead, it applies the quantitative categories of unity, plurality, and totality to synthesize the data into a unified, countable whole. This allows us to perceive not just a fragmented stream of apple impression, like 1 apple impression, 2, and apple impression 3, but to reach the coherent objective judgment, 3 apples on a table. In this sense, the concept of 3, which is totality, is a concept imposed by the mind, not a piece of data found in the senses. Ultimately, the understanding is the source of all necessary and universal laws of nature as they apply to experience. When categories are applied a priori to the realm of possible experience, the phenomenal world, they ensure that the world we inhabit is inherently lawful. This is because the very structure and order that we find in nature, the persistence of objects, the necessary connection of cause and effect, and the unity of systems is not discovered through empirical investigation, but it is rather imposed, created by the mind itself. In this view, we do not discover laws in nature, we read laws into nature. Laws whose warrant and origin lie in the spontaneous activity of the understanding that is happening in our own minds. And lastly, number 3, reason, the drive for ultimate explanation. Reason, the German word is like Vernunft. I'm not German. I'll keep doing this forever, I guess. All right, so reason in the Kantian system stands as the most elevated and conceptually ambitious of the human cognitive faculties. It distinguishes itself fundamentally from the understanding, Verstand, not in scope, but in the very nature, method of its ultimate irresistible goal. While the understanding is confined to the empirical realm, content to impose its rules, the categories, upon sensory experience to generate the objective knowledge of phenomenon, reason is driven by a profound and inherent metaphysical impulse, the quest for unconditioned unity and ultimate explanation. As Professor Daniel N. Robinson, often emphasized in his lectures, reason is the restless faculty. It is never satisfied with the conditioned truths of the understanding, which always points to something else as a cause or a ground. Reason's aspiration is to transcend the fragmented, rule-bound knowledge produced by the understanding, synthesizing it into a complete, comprehensive, and absolute system. This drive pushes the mind inevitably, though dangerously, beyond the confines of empirical observation and possible experience. To grasp reason's role, one must first appreciate its contrast with the understanding. In the terminology of the Paul Guyer translation, the understanding's cognitive products are concepts and judgments, whereas reason produces ideas, transcendental concepts, and inferences. While the understanding scope is immanent, limited strictly to possible experience and appearances, reason scope is transcendent, aiming at the unconditioned or the noumena. Furthermore, while the understanding is constitutive, meaning it actually creates empirical knowledge by ruling over intuitions, reason is primarily regulative, serving to guide the systemic, use of the understanding rather than the creating of objects itself. Reason is not a faculty for forming experience, but a faculty for forming a system. It seeks the unconditioned ground of everything the understanding takes as given and conditioned. Consequently, Kant assigns reason two distinct and critical roles, one legitimate and indispensable for the coherence of knowledge, and the other transcendent, illusory, and the source of all speculative metaphysics. In its dispensable regulative role, reason functions legitimately and productively. It does not generate new objects of knowledge or new truths about the world. Rather, it dictates an essential maxim for the methodical employment of the understanding and empirical research. This functions as a maxim for inquiry, providing a fundamental operational principle that guides all scientific and philosophical inquiry to constantly seek broader, deeper, and more unified systems of explanation. It operates as a continuous internal injunction to the understanding to move from the conditioned, a specific observation or a particular rule, toward the unconditioned, which is the ultimate law or the complete system. This remains true even if its ultimate destination, the absolute, can never be reached in experience. Reason thus sets the necessary horizon for human inquiry, ensuring that knowledge acquisition is not a mere heap of disconnected facts, but a coherent body. The ideas of reason, the soul, the cosmos, and God serve as focal points, or what Kant calls foci imaginari, imaginary focal points. And this is for organizing knowledge. Using Guyer's precise rendering, these are not concepts of objects, but principles for the systematic unity of our empirical findings. For example, the idea of God, understood as ultimate ground, helps organize all possible experience under a single, perfect explanation, lending coherence to our understanding of the world. This heuristic function is essential for the progress of science and the formulation of hypotheses. It functions much like a point on the distant horizon that guides a traveler. Even though the traveler never reaches that exact non-existent focal point, it provides the direction necessary for the journey to be coherent. Now, however, reason also has an improper use, which generates what Kant calls transcendental illusion. So the transcendental illusion. And this occurs when reason misapprehends its own regulative ideas as if they were constitutive concepts of the understanding that could be applied to objects of experience, or worse, to objects beyond possible experience. This error stems from a natural yet unavoidable tendency of the mind to take the necessary demands of its regulative principles, the drive for complete unity, as assertions of objective knowable reality. As Robinson noted, this is not a mistake one simply corrects like a math error. It is an illusion that remains even after it is exposed. Much like an optical illusion persists even when we know the truth. It is the natural and unavoidable dialectic of pure reason. The three primary ideas of reason function as three fields where reason inevitably falls into this illusion, generating the false metaphysical knowledge that the critique of pure reason seeks to dismantle. The first is the soul, the psychological idea, where the focus is at the unconditioned subject of all thought. This leads to the paralogisms of pure reason, where reason attempts to prove the substantiality, the simplicity or immortality of the soul. This results in logical fallacies because the concept of the I, the transcendental subject of apperception, is illegitimately treated as a permanent, knowable, empirical substance. The second field is the cosmos or world, the cosmological idea, representing the unconditioned totality of all appearances. This leads to the antinomies of pure reason, where reason attempts to establish the nature of the world whole, debating, for instance, whether the universe has a beginning in time or is infinite, or whether there is freedom versus total necessity. These attempts lead to unavoidable and equally compelling contradictions, theses and antitheses, demonstrating that reason is incapable of resolving these questions because they transcend the limits of possible experience. The third field is God, the theological idea, the unconditioned ground of all possibility. This leads to the ideals of pure reason, where reason attempts to demonstrate the necessary existence of a supreme being through metaphysical proofs such as ontological or cosmological arguments. This results in dogmatism, where a purely conceptual ideal is mistakenly posited as an objectively existing knowable reality. When reason speculates beyond possible experience, attempting to establish nominal truths through a priori means, it oversteps its bounds. The result is not knowledge, but empty contradictions. The ultimate lesson of the transcendental dialectic is that while reason compels us to seek the unconditioned, its legitimate function in theoretical philosophy is strictly immanent, providing systematic unity within the boundaries of experience and never transcendent. The true positive role, the positive role of these ideas is found not in theoretical speculation, but in practical philosophy, where the ideas of freedom, immortality, and God become postulates necessary for the possibility of moral action. All right, so I am officially over the time that I wanted to be. This has gone over 2 hours now, but I want to wrap this up with a summary of what we just went through. So I'm going to ask you to imagine stepping into an observatory on a pitch black night. If we are to understand how the human mind constructs reality and escapes the skeptical abyss left by David Hume, we must examine the instruments inside this room, Before we can weave these threads together into a new foundation for knowledge, we need to briefly inspect the three distinct faculties of cognition. How do we get from the chaotic influx of starlight to the undeniable laws of physics? The answer lies in the dynamic interplay of sensibility, understanding, and reason. So, really quickly, just to nail these down, sensibility is the receptive lens. If we gaze up at the night sky, light simply washes over our eyes. This raw reception is the domain of sensibility. It is the fundamental passive receptive faculty of the human mind. We do not choose to feel the cold air or see the flash of a meteor. These sensations are given to us. Yet sensibility is not a complete blank slate. The telescope lens through which we look is curved in a very specific way. As Immanuel Kant observed, we never experience raw, unformatted data. Every sensation we receive is instantly structured by the two pure forms of human intuition, space and time. Before you even begin to think about an object, your sensibility has already mapped it spatially outside of you and temporally in a sequence of moments, A, B, C, as you think, oh, there's a star, look at the light, these kind of things. That's time. Okay, so sensibility delivers the raw spatio-temporal materials of experience, but it cannot tell us what those materials actually mean. It gives us a world of shapes and sequences, but it remains entirely mute. And that leads us to understanding, the active cartographer. To make sense of the mute data provided by sensibility, we need an active interpreter. This is the understanding. If sensibility is passive reception, the understanding is spontaneous action. It is the faculty of concepts and rules. When sensibility hands us the sequence of visual impressions, a cue ball moving or a sharp crack, the light, the 8-ball rolling away, the understanding steps in with its own pure structural concepts, which Kant called the categories. Those are the 4 categories. The understanding applies the concept of causality to bind all of those impressions together, declaring this caused that. It applies the concept of substance to recognize that the billiard ball remains the exact same object even as it rolls across the table. As Kant so beautifully warned us, intuitions without concepts are blind, but thoughts without content are empty. Now, dig into that one, because that's actually one of his most famous quotes. So, intuitions without concepts are blind, but thoughts without content are empty. The understanding without sensibility has nothing to think about. So, just as a cartographer or a map maker without land has nothing to draw, right? But sensibility without the understanding is merely a blooming, buzzing confusion, a blind flood of light and noise. Only when the active rules of understanding synthesize the passive data of sensibility do we finally achieve actual experience. And finally, reason, the horizon seeker. If sensibility and understanding together are enough to give us the physical world and the laws of science, why do we need a third faculty? Reason operates on an entirely different level. While the understanding is content to connect one physical cause to another physical effect, reason is never satisfied. It is the faculty of the unconditioned, the imagination, the imaginatory, the illusory. Reason constantly pushes us to ask the ultimate questions. It demands to know not just how one planet moves, but the origin of the entire cosmos. It seeks God, freedom, and the immortal soul, ideas that sensibility can never deliver and the understanding can never process. Because they exist completely outside of physical space and time, Reason is fundamentally a regulative force. It drives us toward total systemic unity, pushing the scientist to find a single unifying theory of physics and urging the philosopher to seek absolute moral truth. However, as we will see, it is also the source of profound danger. When reason tries to bypass sensibility and understanding to claim objective knowledge about the universe beyond our senses, it generates the very metaphysical illusions that trapped Leibniz in his armchair. And don't forget, we've made instruments now, right? Like telescopes, and, we've invented forms of math that, that can give us further acquisition of knowledge. So toward the synthesis, we now have the three vital components laid bare upon our table. We have the passive net of sensibility, capturing space and time, the active machinery of understanding, organizing it with rules and categories, and the restless compass of reason demanding ultimate unity. None of these faculties can function in isolation without plunging us into either dogmatic illusion or skeptical despair, or just straight up chaotic confusion. Our task now is to watch the machinery engage. We must turn our gaze to how these distinct powers combine to rescue the laws of nature and human freedom. We are now headed toward the Kantian synthesis, the breathtaking architecture that rebuilds the foundations of human knowledge from the ground up. And that will be in part B. I have decided to break this into parts because it's just too long. So part 1 will have an A, a B, and by the looks of it, it's going to have a part C. All right. So thanks a lot. And when we start next time, we're going to be doing the Kantian synthesis, a new foundation for knowledge.